11.5 kilos of fentanyl, including an astounding approximately 3 million fentanyl pills.
At 4 o'clock in the morning, Chicago was locked in a brutal winter stillness. The streets were frozen, the sky pitch black, the kind of darkness where sound carries farther and danger hides easier. Freight trains continued to rumble through the city's vast rail network, hauling cargo that kept the Midwest alive, unaware that beneath that routine motion, something far more sinister had taken root. The tip was specific military-grade rifles moving through a Southside warehouse. Not handguns, not street weapons, firearms designed for combat. The city had survived the confrontation, but survival was not the same as safety. What came next would determine whether Chicago's victory lasted, or whether Steel Flood would be remembered as the first battle in a much longer war. When Operation Steel Flood officially concluded, the numbers alone told a story most cities never want to hear. More than 1,600 federal agents from ICE, FBI, ATF, US Marshals, Illinois State Police, and CPD had simultaneously struck 20 locations targeting 800 individuals tied to a single cartel network. Hundreds were taken into custody. Tons of fentanyl and war-grade rifles were seized. A paramilitary organization had been ripped out of the heart of Chicago's logistics system. But numbers don't capture what truly mattered. What this operation exposed was how close Chicago had come to becoming something else entirely, a permanent node in an international paramilitary empire. Lozetta didn't just exploit the city, it nearly integrated with it. Rail lines, warehouses, freight routes, trucking corridors. The same infrastructure that fuels the Midwest economy had been quietly repurposed to move poison and weapons at industrial scale. Federal commanders were clear behind closed doors. This was not a one-off threat, it was a model. The greatest danger Lozetta represented wasn't the gunfire at Warehouse 17 or the brief firefight near the Calumet River. It was the silence that came before. The years when containers moved unnoticed, when coded language passed through encrypted channels, when unmarked vans arrived at midnight and left before dawn. That silence is what allowed a cartel built for war to grow inside one of America's busiest cities without triggering alarms. Chicago's leadership understood the implications. Winning the raid was not the same as winning the future. Removing hundreds of cartel operatives created space that other organizations were already studying. Federal intelligence warned that power vacuums invite competition. Smaller crews would test boundaries. Other international cartels would probe for weakness. The question wasn't if someone would try to move in, but how quickly and how quietly. That reality reshaped the post-operation strategy. Federal agencies committed to long-term coordination, not short-term victory. Intelligence sharing would remain active. Patrol presence would stay elevated in critical corridors. Financial monitoring of logistics-linked businesses would intensify. Chicago would not be left alone to absorb the aftershocks. At the community level, the lesson was equally stark. Lozetta didn't recruit with speeches. It recruited with money access and inevitability. To prevent the next wave, the city needed opportunity to move faster than desperation. Youth programs, legitimate employment, re-entry support. These weren't social gestures, they were security measures. When that intelligence reached ICE's Homeland Security Investigations Division, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Senior agents recognized the pattern: rifles, cartel-level narcotics, covert warehousing. This wasn't expansion. Operation Steel Flood will be studied for years, not just as one of the largest interagency cartel takedowns in American history, but as a case study in modern infiltration. The raid proved that cartels no longer need open warfare to conquer territory. All they need is patience, logistics, and silence. Chicago won the battle. Whether it wins the peace depends on what happens next. Because the most dangerous enemy isn't the one firing in the street, it's the one quietly hijacking the systems everyone trusts until the flood arrives again. It was entrenchment. As armored vehicles idled with headlights dimmed and helicopters lifted silently above industrial corridors, Chicago remained asleep, but the city was seconds away from discovering how close it had come to becoming a permanent command hub for a foreign paramilitary empire. At 4 in the morning, the countdown ended. And Chicago was about to feel the flood. Chicago has always been a city defined by movement. Rail lines cut through neighborhoods like steel arteries. Warehouse districts sprawl for miles. Freight moves day and night, feeding factories, farms, and storefronts across the Midwest. For decades, that constant motion represented economic power. But for Lozetta, it represented something else entirely: opportunity. Federal investigators eventually understood a critical truth: Lozetta never intended to fight Chicago the way street gangs do. There were no turf wars over corners, no graffiti signatures, no public displays of dominance. Instead, the cartel moved with military restraint, embedding itself quietly into the city's logistics infrastructure. The objective was not visibility, it was control. Lozetta's leadership structure mirrored that of a paramilitary unit. Many of its members were former elite soldiers, trained in coordinated assaults, counter-surveillance, and strict operational discipline. Orders moved downward through a layered hierarchy. Couriers used encrypted devices. Armed security teams protected warehouses like forward operating bases. Violence, when used, was calculated short, precise, and terrifying enough to ensure silence. This operational sophistication is exactly why the FBI classified Lozetta as a national security threat, not merely a drug cartel. Their Chicago presence wasn't accidental, it was strategic. The city offered unmatched access to rail corridors, interstate highways, cargo yards, and trucking routes capable of moving massive quantities of product without drawing attention. Weapons entered the system disguised as freight. Military-grade rifles, some later recovered in overseas conflict zones, were routed through Illinois using straw purchasers and shell transactions. Drugs followed the same paths. Unusually pure methamphetamine, industrial-scale heroin, and enormous quantities of fentanyl flowed through warehouse corridors and rail depots pouring into the Midwest. Inside a fortified federal command center on the city's west side, silence did not mean calm, it meant synchronization. Yet for months, investigators struggled to connect the dots. What they saw were fragments, anomalous containers, intercepted encrypted conversations, sudden bursts of violence near abandoned industrial lots. Nothing revealed the full picture. There was no obvious headquarters, no visible kingpin, just movement. That confusion was intentional. Lozetta's greatest strength was its ability to appear invisible while operating at scale. Every warehouse looked legitimate. Every trucking firm appeared routine. Every freight car blended into thousands of others. Even experienced agents described the network as a shadow map beneath the city present but hard to trace. The turning point came not through surveillance but through human error. A confidential informant stepped forward with intelligence that shattered the illusion of randomness. The report was specific and alarming: a shipment of military-grade rifles was moving through a warehouse on Chicago's south side. Not pistols, not small arms, rifles built for sustained combat. When that intelligence reached ICE's Homeland Security Investigations Division, the response was immediate. Senior agents recognized the pattern instantly. Rifles plus cartel-grade narcotics plus clandestine warehousing could only mean one thing: Lozetta had sunk roots far deeper into Chicago than anyone had believed. ICE knew it couldn't handle this alone. Within days, the case escalated into a joint interagency task force. The FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force joined not because of drugs, but because Lozetta's tactics resembled insurgency operations. ATF followed, bringing expertise in tracing weapons that vanished into international conflict zones. CPD's Gang Intelligence Unit added street-level insight: safe houses, subtle territorial shifts, neighborhoods that had gone quiet for a reason. What emerged was no longer speculation. It was confirmation. On a massive digital map, 20 red markers pulsed across Chicago: warehouses, stash houses, processing sites, command hubs. Together they revealed a structure federal agents had spent years trying to see clearly: a foreign paramilitary cartel that had quietly transformed Chicago into the logistical backbone of its criminal empire. Chicago wasn't being used. Chicago had been converted. What followed the informant's tip was not an immediate strike, but a long, methodical tightening of the net. Federal agencies understood that moving too early against Lozetta would be catastrophic. This was not a gang that scattered when pressured. This was an organization trained to absorb losses, adapt, and retaliate. To dismantle it, investigators needed patience and proof strong enough to survive the most aggressive legal scrutiny. Over the next 3 years, the investigation spread beneath Chicago like a second invisible city. Surveillance teams rotated through rail yards, trucking depots, and warehouse corridors where Lozetta shipments were suspected to pass. Agents watched forklifts unload containers that looked ordinary from the outside, but moved with unusual security protocols. Drivers followed strict routes. Schedules shifted constantly. Nothing stayed predictable for long. Undercover operatives infiltrated repair shops and logistics warehouses, posing as mechanics, drivers, and subcontractors. They listened more than they spoke. What they heard came in fragments, phrases that meant nothing to outsiders, but everything to the cartel. Wiretaps picked up coded language, long tools, cold engines, night packages. At first, the phrases sounded harmless. Over time, analysts decoded their meaning: rifles, drug loads, and cash. ATF ballistics experts began matching firearms seized overseas to purchases traced back to Illinois straw buyers. The pattern was chilling. Weapons recovered in foreign conflict zones shared manufacturing signatures with guns bought legally in the US, then quietly diverted into Losetta's pipeline. Chicago was no longer just a drug corridor, it was a weapons exporter. At the same time, DEA chemists analyzed narcotics seized during routine traffic stops across Illinois. The results left no doubt. The methamphetamine was unusually pure consistent across batches and chemically identical to product known to originate from industrial super labs operated by Losetta's network. This wasn't decentralized production, it was centralized, controlled, and scaled. Each data point reinforced the same conclusion. Losetta had not stumbled into Chicago, it had engineered its presence. By late 2024, the volume of evidence had reached a critical mass. Federal prosecutors reviewed wiretap surveillance logs, forensic analyses, and financial records. They saw not just crimes, but a coherent operational design, one that mirrored military logistics rather than criminal improvisation. The picture was now unmistakable fortified warehouses guarded by armed sentries, layered command structures issuing encrypted instructions, logistics teams embedded inside legitimate trucking companies, and financial cells laundering money through shell operations. Losetta had built a fully operational hub inside one of America's most important transportation centers. By winter 2024, every agency involved knew exactly what they were facing. This wasn't about making arrests, it was about dismantling an infrastructure before it became permanent. This was not a street gang fighting over corners. This was Losetta, an organization formed by former elite soldiers trained for discipline, brutality, and long-term operations. The FBI classified Losetta as a national security threat, not merely a drug cartel because of how it operated: layered command, encrypted communications, armed sentries, and violence designed not just to kill, but to intimidate entire neighborhoods into silence. Federal prosecutors made the call. It was time to move. The operation was named Steel Flood, a deliberate reference to the overwhelming force that would be required to break a cartel built for endurance. Planning accelerated inside a heavily secured command center on Chicago's west side. Leaders from ICE, FBI, ATF, US Marshals, Illinois State Police, and CPD studied a digital map glowing with red markers. Each marker represented a Losetta-linked site weapons caches, drug processing labs, stash houses, and 2 warehouses identified as potential command hubs. The scale was staggering: 800 targets, 1,600 officers, all synchronized down to the minute. The objective was not disruption, it was decapitation, and it would happen before dawn. At 4:42 a.m., the first units rolled out. The timing was not symbolic, it was tactical. Chicago's expressways were still empty, its neighborhoods dark and sealed in winter cold. Armored vehicles moved in disciplined columns, engines low, lights dimmed. Above them, helicopters hovered without spotlights, tracing the industrial corridors that had quietly carried Losetta's lifeblood for years. Sniper teams took positions on rooftops near the southern rail yards, their vantage points chosen weeks earlier. From above, the city looked peaceful. From the ground, it felt like the final seconds before impact. Inside the command center, leaders from ICE, FBI, ATF, US Marshals, Illinois State Police, and CPD watched live feeds flicker to life. Each camera represented a different strike team. Every movement was synchronized. 20 locations, 800 targets, one coordinated wave. The breach began at 4:58 a.m. at Warehouse 17, buried deep inside the sprawling Windstorm Freight Complex. The structure looked unremarkable from the outside steel walls, loading bays, no signage. But intelligence had flagged it as one of Losetta's most heavily fortified sites. At exactly 4:00 a.m., the operation entered its final phase. As the SWAT stack approached the reinforced door, something went wrong. Before the ram could swing, gunfire erupted from inside. The sound cut through the frozen air in sharp, controlled bursts, not the chaotic spray of street violence, but disciplined fire. These were trained shooters. Federal agents dropped flat as rounds cracked across the empty lot. For a split second, Warehouse 17 transformed from a target into a battlefield. Snipers positioned on a neighboring rooftop reacted instantly. Through optics, they identified 2 gunmen firing from behind stacked pallets inside the structure. 2 precise shots ended the threat. Flashbangs detonated, flooding the interior with light and concussion. The steel door finally gave way, crashing inward under coordinated force. Agents surged inside, voices echoing commands through smoke and ringing ears. Forklifts sat frozen mid-task. Pallets towered like barricades. 3 Lozetta members, still armed, attempted to hold their ground behind industrial equipment. They fought until the sheer volume of agents pouring into the building overwhelmed them. At that exact moment across Chicago, identical scenes unfolded. Near Cicero Avenue, a warehouse security detail tried to escape in 2 pickup trucks. Armored units boxed them in before they could fire a single round. In South Chicago, a row house reinforced with sandbags became a strong point until a breaching charge detonated and the suspects surrendered instantly. By 7:10 a.m., the operation reached its peak. Hundreds were in custody. Weapons lay stacked on concrete floors. Drugs sat in industrial packaging. Money counters hummed beside ledgers and encrypted phones. Logistics notebooks detailed routes that had fed the Midwest for years. What investigators saw in real time confirmed what intelligence had warned Chicago was not a secondary market. It was the distribution nerve center of Lozetta's network. As dawn broke, the city began to wake up unaware that it had just witnessed the largest cartel takedown in its history. For federal agents, however, the mission was far from over. 600 federal agents stood ready. ICE, FBI, ATF, U.S. Marshals, Illinois State Police, and the Chicago Police Department prepared to strike 20 locations simultaneously, targeting 800 individuals in a single coordinated wave. The scale rivaled the largest federal takedowns in modern American history. Phase 1 had shattered the cartel's defenses. Phase 2 would turn chaos into proof. As the final shots echoed out of Warehouse 17, federal agents shifted instantly from assault posture to forensic discipline. What moments earlier had been a firefight now became a controlled crime scene. Yellow evidence markers appeared across the concrete floor. Shell casings were cataloged. Every inch of the building was sealed, photographed, and logged. This phase mattered just as much as the raid itself, because this was where speculation would become proof. Inside Warehouse 17, the air still smelled of gunpowder. A forklift riddled with bullet holes stood frozen near the loading bay, its metal frame tagged and cordoned off. Agents methodically peeled back layers of the warehouse that Lozetta had designed to deceive. Behind what appeared to be a routine wall of stacked pallets, investigators uncovered a false partition. Behind it was the first confirmation federal prosecutors had waited years to see. Crated in military wrapping were rifles, their serial numbers professionally obliterated, not damaged, not scratched, erased with precision. ATF ballistics experts immediately recognized the pattern. These weapons matched firearms previously recovered in foreign conflict zones. The same make the same manufacturing signatures. This discovery shattered any remaining doubt. Chicago was not just moving drugs. Chicago was a weapons pipeline. At another southern target, agents breached a fortified interior room that felt less like a gang hideout and more like a forward operating base. Freight route maps covered corkboards. Colored strings connected Texas ports to Illinois rail hubs. Encrypted tablets lay open on a steel table, still logged into an active messaging channel marked with the Lozetta emblem. The room revealed operational planning, not improvisation. Federal investigators stood quietly for a moment, absorbing the implications. Beneath the freight trains that passed through Chicago every day, tons of fentanyl and war-grade rifles had been moving in plain sight, undetected, uninterrupted. Elsewhere in the city, a secondary confrontation unfolded at a 2-story residence on Ashland Avenue, believed to function as both a cash and drug stash house. When U.S. Marshals breached the structure, a mid-level Lozetta commander attempted to flee down the back stairwell, firing wildly down the hallway. A deputy marshal returned 2 controlled shots, striking the suspect in the leg. The remaining occupants surrendered immediately. The operation had a name that matched its intent: Operation Steel Flood. On the second floor, agents discovered steel drums filled with rubber-banded cash and spiral notebooks open to pages detailing payouts, bribes, and shipping schedules. Each line item revealed the organization's internal structure, a 3-tier military-style hierarchy: weapons handlers, logistics teams embedded within trucking companies, a financial wing laundering money through commodity brokers, and at the top, a Chicago Plaza boss reporting directly to Mexico. As evidence from across the city converged, prosecutors began stitching together the full picture. ATF matched dozens of rifles to overseas seizures. DEA confirmed that the meth seized throughout Chicago originated from a single network of super labs across the border. FBI analysts decrypted communications outlining plans to expand distribution beyond Illinois into Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Ohio. What had once appeared as isolated crimes now formed a single unmistakable truth. Lozetta had built a paramilitary logistics empire inside one of America's most critical transportation hubs. And for the first time, federal authorities had the evidence to prove it. As sunrise crept across Chicago, the city began to move again, but the operation was far from finished. Inside the command center, federal agents stared at live drone feeds and thermal imagery streaming in from the remaining target zones. The first wave had shattered Lozetta's defenses, but no one believed the cartel had been fully neutralized. Organizations built like this never disappear in a single blow. Some Lozetta members had vanished the instant the first doors came down. Others were already attempting to regroup following the same playbook the cartel had used for years in Mexico: find elevation, find cover, and fight long enough to escape. The difference now was geography. Chicago's abandoned industrial landscape, grain silos, empty plants, forgotten rail facilities offered hiding places as dangerous as any urban battlefield. One of those sites sat near the old grain silos along the Calumet River. An ICE ATF quick reaction team detected movement inside the upper floors of the abandoned plant. Thermal imaging revealed 2 armed suspects positioned behind rusted machinery, elevated and prepared. This was no panicked flight. It was a deliberate defensive posture. As agents advanced, the suspects opened fire from above. Rounds sparked off steel beams and concrete pillars. The sound echoed violently through the hollow structure, transforming the plant into an amplifier of chaos. Agents took cover behind the thick concrete silos, returning steady, disciplined fire. There was no shouting, no disorder, just controlled movement and precise communication. Chicago was the perfect host for Lozetta's expansion. Its rail yards, warehouse districts, and endless freight corridors allowed drugs, weapons, and money to move unnoticed. War-grade rifles later traced to overseas conflict zones passed through cargo routes. Fentanyl shipments, powerful enough to kill thousands, flowed into the Midwest on the same trains commuters watched every day. Cash was laundered through trucking companies, repair shops, and shell businesses embedded into the city's economic bloodstream. The gunfight lasted less than 40 seconds. It was brief, violent, and telling. Lozetta did not do surrender. When the suspects were down, teams moved in, immediately clearing the structure floor by floor. Inside, they uncovered additional evidence that reinforced what investigators already knew: vacuum-sealed fentanyl bricks stamped with Lozetta markings, lockers filled with rifle components and tactical gear, and handwritten ledgers listing payouts to drivers across 5 states. This wasn't desperation, it was contingency. As federal agents completed the final sweep, the scope of the operation became undeniable. Operation Steel Flood had not just disrupted a cartel network, it had forced it into open confrontation on American soil. That alone marked a turning point. Over the next 48 hours, agents cataloged everything left behind: hidden basement labs, encrypted phones, spare weapons, caches, financial records stretching back years. Each item was logged, photographed, and packaged as part of a case that prosecutors now described as ironclad. By the end of the weekend, the evidence filled an entire federal warehouse. The charges followed quickly: conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, international weapons, trafficking money, laundering, racketeering, and providing material support to a criminal enterprise. Some defendants faced mandatory minimum sentences. Others, especially those tied to the weapons pipeline, were staring at life in federal prison. What began as scattered intelligence fragments had now become a unified case capable of dismantling a paramilitary cartel operating in the heart of one of America's largest cities. For months, investigators saw only fragments, odd containers, coded wiretap language, sudden spikes of violence near abandoned lots. Nothing pointed to a single command node until one confidential informant changed everything. Chicago had witnessed the battle. Now it would witness the fallout. In the hours following Operation Steel Flood, Chicago slipped into an unfamiliar quiet, the kind that settles in only after a storm no one realized was raging until it passed. Police radios crackled non-stop. Federal convoys rolled through industrial corridors once ruled by fear. Helicopters traced slow, deliberate circles across the southern skyline. For the first time in years, the movement was controlled, orderly, no longer dictated by Lozetta's invisible hand. At City Hall, leaders from federal, state, and local agencies stood shoulder to shoulder for a joint press conference. Their message was careful, deliberate, and unmistakable. This was not just a successful raid, it was a warning. Lozetta had come dangerously close to establishing a permanent paramilitary stronghold inside America's most important logistics capital and had nearly succeeded. In neighborhoods hit hardest by the cartel's presence, residents stepped outside and watched armored vehicles disappear down streets that had once felt occupied. For years, people had lived with unmarked vans arriving at midnight coded handoffs near loading docks, and the quiet understanding that certain blocks no longer truly belonged to the city. That unspoken tension had shaped daily life, when to walk, when to speak, when to look away. Now there was a cautious sense of relief, but there was no celebration. Chicago understands something federal commanders understand too well. Removing a cartel does not end the threat, it creates a vacuum. Power vacuums attract predators. Smaller crews move quickly to fill the gap. Other international cartels watch closely, calculating whether the territory is worth reclaiming. Inside federal briefings, that reality shaped the next phase of response. Agencies pledged a long-term presence, not a victory lap. Sustained intelligence teams would remain embedded. Patrol units would continue backing CPD in vulnerable corridors. Surveillance would not stop simply because the headlines faded. At the same time, another front quietly opened, one that could not be won with weapons alone. Community leaders stepped forward. Youth programs expanded. Re-entry support and legitimate job pipelines were strengthened, aimed at cutting off the cartel's most reliable resource recruitment. Federal officials were blunt in private discussions. If the city failed to protect vulnerable neighborhoods, the next organization would arrive faster and smarter. Operation Steel Flood exposed something deeply unsettling. Lozetta had not needed open warfare to gain control. It had hijacked rails, highways, warehouses, and trucking routes, the systems the entire country depends on. It didn't take blocks with gunfire, it took them with logistics. As analysts reviewed the final intelligence summaries, one conclusion emerged with brutal clarity: Chicago had not just been targeted, it had been selected. Its infrastructure made it valuable, its scale made it efficient, its constant motion made it easy to hide.